Hello, everyone. I'm Annabelle Kwanhaze, a professor of digital media and methods at the Department of Sociology and the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. As the current Rogers Chair in Studies in Journalism and New Information Technology, I want to welcome you all to today's Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm delighted to have our first hybrid event, and I'm very much hoping that everything will run smoothly. This may be the future of normal. Who knows? Some of us having lunch and coffee on Zoom, and some of us having cookies and coffee in a physical space. So I want to welcome you all in London, in Ontario, in Canada, and wherever you are. I would like to start our event with Western's land acknowledgement to create awareness of Indigenous peoples' presence and connections to these lands, as well as the ongoing struggles and injustices. With great respect, we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chononton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant with the Lumpton Belt. Let's reflect on our responsibility to honor these existing treaties and covenants. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. For this event, we have partnered with Media Smarts and their Media Literacy Week. In fact, today is Media Smart's first annual Digital Citizen Day. So we encourage all Canadians to share what it means to be a digital citizen using the hashtag Digital Citizen Day. So join us on social media and voice your thoughts. Following the talk, we have organized a panel of graduate students entitled Being Online, Establishing Communities of Care for Digital Sociologists, which will look at the emotional labor that researchers from all fields experience when conducting research online, including ethnographies, as a result of either censorship, hate speech, or misogyny. So join us for this event on Zoom at 2 p.m. Next, I would like to provide some information about the format of today's talk. So first, I will introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Heidi Tworek. Welcome, Dr. Tworek. So nice you can join us from beautiful Vancouver. And I've been told that the background is real. So I was quite impressed. So then Dr. Tworek will give a 40-minute lecture followed by a Q&A period. I will moderate the Q&A period. Questions can be asked both in person as well as via our chat on Zoom. So we welcome questions from everyone. Now that we have the logistics figured out, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Tworek. So Dr. Tworek is a Canada Research Chair, Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and Associate Professor of International History and Public Policy in the Department of History at UBC. So that's why the beautiful background. Dr. Tworek received her BA in Modern and Medieval Languages with a double first from Cambridge University, and earned her MA and PhD in history from Harvard University. Dr. Tworek has held visiting fellowships at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, DC, the Center for Contemporary History, Potsdam, Germany, and the Birkbeck at University of London, UK. She has also taught as a guest lecturer at Freie Universität in Berlin and in Göttingen University. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, as well as a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute She co-edits the journal Global Affair. Her most recent book is the prize-winning News from Germany, the competition to control world communications 1900 to 1945. It was published with Harvard University Press in 2019. Alongside co-editing 4 volumes, Dr. Tworek has written over 45 journal articles and book chapters, as well as many policy reports on online abuse, health communications, explanatory journalism, and digital democracy. She's also advised multiple governments, including serving on the expert advisory group on online safety for the Heritage Ministry in Canada. Her writing has been published in English and German in major magazines and newspapers, including Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Globe and Mail, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Zeit, and The Conversation. Her work has been featured in publications such as the New York Times, Financial Times, and CNN, just to name a few. We are delighted to have Dr. Tworek share her influential work with us today. So let's give Dr. Tworek a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And if we can just make sure maybe to pin the camera on me, because I think some of the people in the online audience can only see the audience rather than me, then that would be super. And I'm just going to share my slides so that we can then go through. So first of all, I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people here in Vancouver. And I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually, and thanks so much to Annabelle Kranhase for the invitation to speak to you today. So a couple of weeks ago, now just over a month ago, there was, of course, a momentous event that tied together the UK, where I grew up, and Canada, which was the funeral of the Queen. And of course, CBC interviewed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his wife, asking them about their relationship to the Queen. And in one of the memories that Justin Trudeau shared, he said, you know, I would speak to the Queen about all sorts of things, including things like disinformation and cybersecurity that he said did not exist at the time of Churchill. Now, I would argue as a historian that Trudeau is one of many who perhaps has a bit of a misconception, thinking that questions like disinformation and cybersecurity are new. We don't know what the Queen ever said to him, but perhaps she may have held her counsel rather than reminding Trudeau that, in fact, even questions like cybersecurity go back at least to World War II, when in the UK, the use of Bletchley Park was a key method to break some of Germany's codes, and indeed was quite influential in some of the later creation of computing after World War II. Many of you may have seen documentaries or films about Bletchley Park and may remember people like Alan Turing, who later committed suicide because of the discrimination against him because of his homosexuality. Bletchley Park too, a place where women were truly integral, but often written out of that history afterwards to be subsequently rewritten in by historians like Ma Hicks. So what I'm going to do in my talk today then is to try and combine the old and the new, to talk a little bit about the history of disinformation, but then to talk about what we're actually seeing today as well, to try to tease out what is new and what is old, what is unprecedented and what is perhaps precedented, to coin a term. And I'm going to do so wearing my two hats, one as a historian and one as a person who works on disinformation and online abuse in the present, particularly in Canada. So first, very briefly, I'll just define dis and misinformation, talk a little bit about the history of disinformation to really tease out its multiple motivations, particularly reminding us that while we often think about it as a political phenomenon, it's very much also an economic one as well. I'll then move on to talk about some of my research, which has focused on the question of online abuse, particularly of professional groups in Canada, and the many ways in which that overlaps with disinformation, because much of that online abuse is often based on false claims about individuals or about their motivations. But I don't want to leave us all in an nadir of despair, so we'll then go on and talk about some of the initiatives in Canada that are trying to push back against some of the problems of disinformation and online abuse, before ending with some research, tentative as it is, on what individuals can do in terms of combating disinformation. So firstly, to get us all on the same page, we often throw around these terms dis and misinformation. For some of us in academia, we love to engage in questions, obviously, of definitions, but I think it's always worth redefining these two in particular. So misinformation generally means something that is misleading or false, but the people who are sharing it do not necessarily mean to cause harm. So I tend to think about this as misinformation as some kind of misleading or mistake, to tie those two together, whereas disinformation in the academic definitions is something deliberately spread by malign actors with some kind of harmful aim, where there may be political or economic motivations, or indeed both, and I'll come back to that. So the D, the deliberate, for disinformation. And one of the key issues often in trying to determine whether something is dis or misinformation is that to determine whether something is deliberately spread is actually quite a hard thing to do. Is it something that people actually believed was false when they spread it? Or was it a choice to amplify certain types of narratives that may in fact be true, but for nefarious purposes? So this is part of what makes it quite hard to determine whether something is mis or disinformation. It requires not just understanding how that information is spread, but what people thought about that information and why they were spreading it. So that, of course, requires a whole host of disciplines, and sometimes takes us beyond what researchers actually may find possible, which is why some researchers like to talk about misinformation more than disinformation, because it doesn't assume intent. During the pandemic, there was one other term which came to the fore, the infodemic, often used by Dr. Tedros, here seen on your left, the Director General of the World Health Organization, who said very early on in the pandemic that there was not only the pandemic of COVID-19, but also a pandemic of flawed and false information, which he termed the infodemic. And here I give you on the right just one example of the many conspiracy theories. These ones were surrounding the conspiracy theory that Bill Gates had created the pandemic so that he could make money from the vaccines that would be sold. This term has been most tied, as I've said, to COVID-19. It actually existed before that, was very much amplified by Dr. Tedros, although for some researchers, they question whether this is actually a useful term and whether we should think about information spreading like a virus, or whether it in fact has other characteristics, something we can certainly debate in the Q&A. So now that we've got a little bit of the definitional stuff done with, I want to just talk a little bit about the history of disinformation. The main point I want to drive home here is simply that disinformation or misinformation has existed for at least as long as newspapers, if not long before that. And we see even at the very beginning of newspapers in the 17th century already engagement and satire of false news or fake news or disinformation, whatever term we want to use. So an English satirist, hopefully well known to some of you, though not as famous as Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, already in 1620 and then later in 1625, produced literary works. The first one on the left here is something called a masque, which would be performed at the court of King James II, and then the staple of news, which was a longer play. And in both of these, Jonson is actually satirizing the new hunger for news in England, which had arose with the beginnings of newspapers in the German lands and then in England. And you'll see that what he does also, and I've just picked out one quotation here, just to give you one example, is that he's also talking about how in the masque here, News from the New World Discovered in the Moon, one of his main points is that what the printer is trying to do with news is simply to print it, to sell it, whether it is false or true. And so what this masque is satirizing is the idea that the printer and others will sell the idea that there are people living in the moon and that this is something they're selling in order to sell more of their newspaper. So you'll see the printer here says, "Indeed, I am all for sale, gentlemen. You say true. I'm a printer and a printer of news, and I do hearken after them wherever they be at any rates. I'll give anything for a good copy now, be it true or false, so it be news." And you can imagine this sort of dynamic very much in the 21st century as well. So the dynamic between news that is true versus news that may not be true and may be being sold for profit is as old as the newspaper itself. It's a feature as part of the news environment, as difficult as that is for us to grapple with, not a bug. But there are, of course, some ways in which this develops. I'm not saying that everything is the same in the 21st century as it was in the 1620s. Newspapers themselves, of course, change dramatically. And one of the things that changes is the inclusion of ever more advertisements. And this reminds us that one of the key reasons for disinformation is not necessarily for political reasons, but in fact for profit. If we were to look at a whole host of digitized newspapers, which I often do with my students in a history of news course, what we find, of course, is that 50% of the newspapers advertisements of various sorts. And in the 19th and early 20th century, a huge number of those advertisements were for what was called patent medicine. So these were types of medicine that could simply be sold by anybody. There was no license. And they made all sorts of claims ranging from cocaine toothache drops that are going to give you a miraculous cure to your toothache, all the way through to wizard oils, etc. And this is where the term snake oil originates, because you can, in fact, find advertisements that are advertising snake oil as a cure for many different types of diseases. So we see in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in places like the United States in particular, that many of the advertisements are in fact advertising things where it's very unclear whether they're efficacious or not. And this then continues into the 20th century with the development of much of what we now know as public relations in the 1920s, including even the infamous endorsement by many doctors of cigarettes as things that are good for you. And these are just a couple of examples. There were also advertisements that claimed that cigarettes would cure your throat ache, which you can see here at the bottom, your throat protection against irritation, against cough, at least according to this advertisement, was smoking, which we now know to be wholly untrue. This reminds us that newspapers themselves, in terms of their advertisements, were often filled with things that we would now recognize as disinformation. Over the course of the 20th century, patent medicine, at least, comes to be something that is no longer so freely advertised because the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, after a terrible incident in which over 100 people die after taking a poisonous patent medicine, the Food and Drug Administration starts to regulate these types of advertisements and those types of medicines, meaning that as we move forward in the 20th century, these types of drug advertisements are made more towards physicians in the United States, which of course results in its own tragedy with the opioid epidemic that begins towards the end of the 20th century. But this, I think, reminds us disinformation is often for profit and that it has existed in various guises, at least since the mid-19th century within media. The second thing I think to remember is that there have been within history a whole host of quite dramatic incidents that we have in many ways forgotten, where newspapers have mistakenly, in the case that I'm about to show you, mistakenly produced information that later turned out to be untrue. And one of the most infamous incidents of this was actually the date of the end of World War I. So as we know, World War I ends on November 11th officially, which is why, of course, we have Armistice Day, which we celebrate with, at least in British Columbia, with a day off and with the wearing of poppies. And yet in 1918, most people in the United States actually believed the war had ended on November 7th, 1918. So the picture that I'm showing you here is actually from the Washington Times on November 7th, 1918. This is because a news agency that was based in the United States called the United Press received word that later turned out to be untrue, that Germany had already surrendered. They sent this news to a whole host of newspapers who then all printed it. And in fact, it wasn't immediately corrected. So there was even massive celebrations in cities like New York and others all around the United States. So these are actually pictures from November 7th. Celebration of the end of World War I before, in fact, it was over. Something that was described by one woman, Shirley White, as, quote, wild, fake Armistice Day. And perhaps most pertinently for us, in many cities there were celebrations, despite the fact that there were warnings against gatherings because of the growing flu pandemic. Quite soon after that, on the next day, November 8th, 1918, the United Press was then forced, of course, to send out a correction and say, in fact, the war has not ended, and it was the misunderstanding of what Admiral Wilson had said. So here we see, this is just one example of the Evening World in New York now saying Admiral Wilson assumes responsibility for a report that armistice was signed, when in fact that was untrue. And of course, we see here talking about when the war will actually end. So this is to remind us that even monumental things like the end of World War I were misinterpreted and mis-celebrated. And perhaps that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but I think it does matter for our memory of how information functions and how people interpreted it. Today, we have no disputes over when World War I ended. And this incident has, for most people, in fact, been forgotten. So this is, I think, a reminder of how these types of incidents, whether as mistakes or indeed deliberate, have, even with monumental events like the end of World War I, been a part of how we've interacted with information for at least a century, if not more. Now, of course, I just talked about a mistaken type of misinformation, but in the book that I wrote that Annabelle talked about at the beginning, I also talk about how Germans in the first half of the 20th century tried to control communications networks so they can send out news that they think is conducive to Germany and conducive to its political, economic, and cultural aims. Obviously, over the course of the first half of the 20th century, those aims changed very dramatically, and particularly when the Nazis come to power, they try to use this global network to send out anti-Semitic, homophobic, and racist content that's meant to bolster support for fascism. But they also use this network to try and spread disinformation as well. So at the outbreak of World War II, one of the things that the Nazis tried to do is to actually pin the blame for the outbreak of World War II on the Poles, essentially creating a false flag operation, claiming that the Poles had attacked Germany instead. Now, again, that's an example of an attempt at disinformation that ultimately has no bearing on our memory of that war. But it reminds us that disinformation, as I said, can be something propagated for profit, but also something propagated for politics as well, that has existed pretty much throughout the history of news and newspapers. But having said that, that doesn't mean that what we're experiencing in the 21st century is exactly the same as what I describe in my book or what we might see with the advertisements from the 1920s. So let me now turn then to some of my more contemporary research to try and tease out a little bit what we're seeing today and how online abuse is a particularly important part of what we are seeing. And in doing that, I'm going to draw on some of my own studies and other studies about professional groups, particularly politicians, journalists, and health communicators. Okay, so firstly, let's talk about politicians. One of the studies that I did looking at the federal election of 2019 was to really try and understand with Chris Tenner, who co-wrote the report about it, what types of online abuse politicians actually face and how they respond. And as I said, a lot of online abuse often overlaps with disinformation. It can be things that falsely accuse people of not being sufficiently Canadian or making all sorts of assertions about them. So what we did in this study is we tried to combine different types of analysis. And I think that this speaks to what will happen later this afternoon with graduate students talking about the emotional labor of doing this kind of work. And I'm very happy to talk about that in questions because there's certainly a lot to be said. So what we did is we combined a couple of methods. One is that we did some Twitter analysis of over 1 million tweets directed at every single political candidate during this election, regardless of their party. So unlike many studies that look just at a few select candidates, we looked at every single candidate, and these were all of the tweets directed at them. But we felt that that didn't really give us enough, right? Just because you get a huge volume of tweets directed at you, we don't know if you're the one actually controlling your social media. We don't know how you feel about it. Volume isn't always a proxy for how it affects people. And so we also did interviews with over 30 candidates and their campaign staff from almost every party in the 2019 election, and then 12 other elected officials to really try to understand, well, even if we measure the volume of this stuff, does it even matter? And how does it really affect people? So what we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that Twitter was not a happy place. And we tried to do this by dividing negativity. So one of the things that we tried to do in our study also was to separate between discussions, rigorous and vigorous, of policy and attacks on individuals. So I'll show you a couple of examples of low, medium, and high negativity tweets, but you'll see that they are directed at individuals. So we spent a lot of time coding and making sure that things that were discussions of policy, even if they had swear words or anything else like that, weren't seen as negative, but were put into the neutral category. So we developed some of our own machine learning models. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that in questions. But as you can see, we found that Twitter, not a happy place, because at least 16% of the tweets were what we thought of as online abuse, things that were high or medium negativity, but overall, basically 40% of the tweets directed at candidates were negative in some form, and only 7% were positive. 11% unclear. That could be things like memes, photos, links to videos, and so on that we then weren't able to categorize using our machine learning. So just as a warning, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these just to give you a sense of what we mean by low, medium, and high, but they're not some of the worst examples that we saw. So low negativity, we said, was something that was dismissive or somewhat disrespectful. So this is just to give you one of the examples that we pulled out from our data set. Medium negativity was something that was insulting or very disrespectful. So you'll see here all the sort of accusations of being corrupt, etc., and the ending your bid, which has a slight threatening undertone to it as well. And then finally, things that were high negativity that were threatening, hateful, and abusive in some way. And here you can see there's a typo as well. It should be your instead of you, but these are, again, real world examples that we've taken. One of the other things that we did that was a little bit different than some other studies is we thought that we as researchers weren't the sole authorities on how we could actually categorize these tweets. And so we took what we call a battery, so an example of 5 or 6 tweets, and we would ask in each of the interviews how the interviewees themselves would classify these tweets. So did they see them as low, medium, or high negativity? And then once we'd done that, we could go back and feed that into our model. So this is not just us as researchers sitting in the ivory tower deciding this. This is actually with input from our interviewees. And we found there was actually quite a lot of overlap in regardless of identity, how people tended to evaluate low, medium, and high negativity, which is quite useful for us. There were, though, some differences. So, for example, we had one tweet that was, "You're also beautiful, I wish you were my wife," or "You're also handsome, I wish you were my husband." And for many of the male interviewees, they didn't see that as particularly threatening, something maybe low negativity, annoying, but not a big deal. Whereas for some of the female interviewees, they saw this as medium or high negativity because they felt that this was actually something that could be a precursor to a stalker, something that some of them had experienced in real life. So that's just to give you one of the examples where we did see some differentiation depending on people's identities and, very importantly, their lived experiences, which is why the interviews were so crucial. We also, of course, looked at the factors of gender and race. It was very much meant to be an intersectional analysis. We were particularly focusing on gender and race and the question of whether people's identities then led to more abuse. And what we found was that the most correlation was between the prominence of the person and how much abuse they received. So it wasn't necessarily that there was more frequent abuse for those with intersectional identities. However, we did find that almost all female and racialized candidates did receive online abuse that was targeting their identities. And this is a very big distinction. So there was often quite a lot of abuse at, for example, party leaders, white male party leaders, etc. But a lot of that abuse might not have been about them. It might have been about other groups, but using their Twitter to piggyback onto it and express, for example, Islamophobic views. Whereas what we saw with almost all female and racialized candidates was that the online abuse they were receiving was targeting their identity. And maybe I'll give you one sort of vaguely innocuous example, which is if we think about Catherine McKenna, and one of the terms of abuse used against her was "quote unquote" climate Barbie. So here we see a misogynist type of abuse that's denigrating her ability, but it's mixed then with her portfolio at the time, which was climate. And this we saw with women and racialized candidates. Even when there was then a discussion of their competency, it would be mixed with some sort of abuse that was targeting their identity. So the other things that we found, the interviewees also told us, is that much of the content that they were seeing online also mirrored or amplified offline discrimination or threats, including disinformation about them, how they operated, where they came from, et cetera, et cetera. And that, especially for the high-profile individuals, some of the attacks there, as I've said, were meant not necessarily to abuse that individual, but to send a message to marginalized groups in some way. So we found there was, in some, misogyny and racism opposed to all politicians, regardless of their identity, which means that it's actually a task for all politicians to be addressing, regardless of whether that abuse was directed at them or not, and perhaps even more so for those who are not being directly attacked. But if any politician looks through their posts, they will see that the internet has quite a lot of misogyny and racism. Then, of course, as a historian, I had to ask myself, what's new about this dynamic that I've described? What is different than the world of snail hate mail to politicians, etc., things that we, of course, know existed before, or even email abuse, which we still find for many people is actually a huge source of abuse. So we identified 4 things that seemed quite new. One was the lack of accountability for abusive users. Sometimes, depending on the platform, they might be taken down for a short period of time, but many of our interviewees told us that there was actually a lack of accountability, lack of enforcement from platforms. It's very time-consuming to report these kinds of things. The second was that the features of the platforms, the affordances, what platforms enabled people to do, were meaning that there was faster, further reach and more pervasiveness of this kind of problematic content. So of course, instead of a letter being sent to your parliamentary office that only you see, now this was being seen by a huge number of people, and potentially even further amplified by algorithms in ways that it's hard for researchers from the outside to really comprehend. But what we know from psychological studies is that humans are more motivated by the negative than the positive, and this unfortunately plays out on social media in a whole host of ways where we see more of the negative than the positive, and that obviously played out in our statistics as well. And the third thing that we found is, although many people would want what we might call healthy conversations, including Twitter, which is trying to do research on healthy conversations, at least for now, that there were actually insufficient tools and incentives for those kinds of conversations, that platforms were not geared and engineered towards having constructive conversations. And then finally, that the platforms, every one of them in different ways, had lots of lack of transparency, which made it very hard for both the political candidates, but also for us as researchers to answer a whole host of the questions that you might have. So when you ask questions in the Q&A, there may be things that I will honestly say, I can't possibly tell you because we don't have sufficient insight. And this is one of the things that the expert advisory group to the Heritage Ministry during the summer, of which I was part, really emphasized. That actually we really do have a lack of understanding of many platforms, in part because of their lack of transparency, whether the platforms themselves don't collect that type of data or they don't want to know about certain problems. These remain open questions. And I'll just give you one example of how this lack of transparency is problematic. So you'll see that our study was about Twitter, but actually in 2019, the most used platform was Facebook. But we didn't end up being able to get access to Facebook. And even if we had, the tool that was used at the time called CrowdTangle would not have given us as much access to the types of comments on political candidates' pages as we got with Twitter. So we wouldn't have been able to do that kind of big data study. So this, I think, highlights again a lack of transparency. Our study has to be provisional because we're only talking about one platform, Twitter, which is used by a very particular subset of individuals. Okay, I've described a very unfortunate situation for politicians. Unfortunately, since 2019, we see from journalism, this also applies to journalists, and it hasn't got much better. So a survey done in 2021 by Ipsos found that a huge number of journalists were receiving various forms of online harassment, 72% of all journalists, and that queer journalists, 2S LGBTQ journalists were reporting the highest prevalence of online harm of any group, 78% in the last year. Journalists also said that this had gotten worse during the pandemic. So between 2019 and 2021, 84% of those who had experienced some form of online harassment said it had gotten worse. And that was 73% overall of all those who were surveyed. So we see this as a massive problem in Canada for a huge number of journalists, and that online harassment is by far and away the largest type of harassment. And we also see that this is a global trend, that online violence in different ways doesn't just affect journalists in Canada, but also those around the world. And again, in line with our study around politicians, we also find that intersectional identities are a very important way of trying to understand what is happening. So Jewish women journalists, lesbian women journalists, Indigenous women journalists, more of them are experiencing online violence than, for example, heterosexual or white women journalists. And this was a study that was conducted by UNESCO that came out in 2021. And lastly, the final professional group I'm going to talk about here is health communicators, some of whom, at least in this survey, were scientists. This was a survey conducted in 2021 by Nature, which found that 15% of the respondents said they had received death threats. You see almost 60% of them had received some sort of attack on their credibility. And that most of these attacks were in fact happening online. You'll see here that the number of physical attacks was actually quite low, that many of the negative impacts that scientists were experiencing after speaking about COVID-19 to the media or posting on social media were coming through the online space. There was then another survey that was conducted by Science, which had similar findings, that 38% of those who were researching COVID-19 reported some sort of harassment. And again, we see that the vast majority of them are happening online. Only 6% experienced unwanted visits to work or home, 5% physical intimidation, and actually 0% vandalism of home or property. So this means that if we're trying to address what we might see as an overlapping of harassment and disinformation, the online space is the major place where this is happening. And here I just give you one example to make this very concrete. This was a threat online on Twitter against Catherine Smart, who was then the president of the Canadian Medical Association. Unfortunately, there are many other examples of these sorts of things where here you can see that there are threats to not only Catherine Smart, but also her family's safety. So one of the studies that I have done over the last few months is really trying to figure out, well, what's going on then with health communicators in Canada specifically, and how are disinformation and online abuse overlapping? And this was a report I prepared with Chris Tenove for the British Columbia Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, and they are doing a much bigger investigation into hate during the pandemic in general, and asked us to write about online hate in the pandemic. So we did all sorts of different things. But one of them was to try to understand what had happened with health communicators, which we saw as people who were working for public health, doctors, scientists, and journalists. And we found that there were a lot of the themes of abuse that they were experiencing that very much overlapped with disinformation. These two things could not really be disentangled. And we found sort of 5 main categories, and a lot of these overlap with some other research that's been done into online abuse of health communicators in the United States and in Europe. So one was a lot of discussion of these quote unquote sinister origins of COVID-19, various people covering that up. As you can imagine, a lot of the disinformation directed against Dr. Tam was very much tied up with this, and then anti-Asian racism against Dr. Tam. Second theme, corrupt elites, how the quote unquote corrupt elites of health communicators, but sometimes also politicians, were colluding to take away people's freedoms. And again, this often overlapped with various types of disinformation around COVID-19 or the purported lack of access to quote unquote cures such as ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, both of which do not do anything to help with COVID-19. The third was the idea and the accusation that many of these health communicators or health officials were causing injury or death with their policies rather than trying to save people. A fourth theme, the idea of freedom under siege, which took many forms, some of which for some people culminated in the Freedom Convoy in February of 2022, but in other cases resulted in bizarre interpretations of wanting to prosecute public health officials under the Nuremberg laws and odd misappropriations there. And then that combined with other anti-Semitic themes of quote unquote Jewish globalists who were controlling. So you see here very much how disinformation, conspiracy theories, and online abuse are overlapping in this study. And then finally, a broad theme of the incompetence of public health officials and of communicators. So I've described all of this, but I think it's really important that we go beyond just describing it to really understand why this is a problem. So we might say, well, you know, people don't have to be on social media. It doesn't really matter. We can just do it through institutional accounts, et cetera, et cetera. But I think looking at professional groups is particularly important because many of those professions, you really do have to be online in many ways. To be a political candidate without social media is basically impossible, regardless of how you use it. And the same goes for journalists. And now many public health communicators have found the same goes for them. And the question is also the efficacy. So this is part of why we think about this much more broadly, rather than just looking at the individual piece of content. What's really the effect? So we see four main effects at this point. Our study initially was focusing on British Columbia, but we have a whole host of interviews actually with people around Canada and are writing a report about this. And we see four main, I think, all concerning effects. One is the concern about obviously the psychological health and well-being of people who are experiencing this kind of online abuse, particularly in the world of health communicators, where many of these people were doing this job off the side of their desk. They were working in ERs, they were infectious disease epidemiologists, and they were doing this on top because they felt a deep need to inform the public. But their psychological health and well-being was being damaged by the type of online abuse that they were receiving. The second thing was that often undermined their professional effectiveness. They had to spend so much time dealing with these types of threats and so on, that it undermined their efficacy at work. And in some cases, they really worried about how it might affect their professional reputation. So if they left Twitter, would that be seen as some sort of acknowledgement that these things were true, or would it undermine their reputation as somebody who really was very interested in science and health communication and believed it to be important? So the third aspect of this that has been well documented in other arenas is the question of chilling effects. And what that means then is that an individual speech is chilled. They don't want to engage on these platforms because they're worried about what will happen. And research by John Penny on other arenas of chilling effects has found that women and people from racialized groups are most likely to be affected by chilling effects. And we can imagine all sorts of ways in which that's particularly deleterious within a pandemic that has had disproportionate effects on marginalized communities. And there we're building trust, actually having communicators who come from those communities, know those communities is particularly important, but those may be the people likeliest to remove themselves from the space of online media because of chilling effects. So that's hugely important and hugely concerning. And then fourthly, a classic concern was the corroding of debate and the exacerbation of polarization. But this was also a concern even amongst health communicators themselves. They worried that it was actually a problem for them to have expert discussions around COVID because they were now getting into such polarized positions where even sometimes you had health communicators abusing each other. So they were really worried about the corrosion, not just of general public debate, but actually of high-level scientific debate as well. For example, about what would be the measures to deal with the airborne nature of COVID and so on and so forth. So these then, I think, are some of the ways in which social media perhaps has changed some of the dynamics of what disinformation is actually doing. This doesn't necessarily look like the world of the early 20th century. Okay, I've given you lots of doom and gloom, but now we must end with some slightly more positive notes, which are some of the examples of what people are doing in Canada to deal with some of these questions, very broadly conceived. The first is that I've talked about the challenges of research and also about questions of gender diversity. So the questions of lack of transparency, in particular, lack of data on gender diversity in media. And at Simon Fraser University, Heidi Tworek has created something called a gender gap tracker, which actually looks at the number of women who are quoted in various newspapers. And in fact, we see, regardless of their political bent, it is approximately the same percentage of women, so getting to around 25–30%. So if one of the questions here is making sure that information comes from different sources so that we can ensure more diverse representation within newspapers so that who's speaking in a newspaper represents what Canadians look like, there's still a long way to go. But at least we're starting to have some data to give us the answers to those questions. And hopefully with regulation, we'll be able to answer more of those questions on social media as well. Secondly, one of the challenges is why people turn to social media and why they look to those kinds of explanations from experts is because a lot of the academic research obviously is highly inaccessible in a whole host of ways. That means that journalists are often the ones who are writing up studies, sometimes misinterpreting them, doing what some people have called jumping on the preprint, not understanding how peer review functions. And yet lots of academics need help writing for a general public. And final part of this puzzle is with the decline of journalism, unfortunately, in so many ways, there are plenty of journalists who need jobs. So what we need then is more explanatory journalism that can be easily conveyed on social media and online. And one of the solutions here has been the creation by a couple of my colleagues in the School of Journalism, at UBC, Alf Hamida and Mary Lynn Young, of The Conversation Canada, which is a not-for-profit that pairs together journalists with academics to write op-eds about their various pieces of research, and that has been very successful within Canada. It's fully run by journalists. It also has podcasts and so on and so forth, and it runs with a Creative Commons license that means that these articles can be reprinted for free by newspapers as well. So it's a way of trying to make sure that what can be stodgy academic research is more broadly available. A third challenge, of course, which is what I spent a lot of time talking about, is the world of social media, too much misinformation, disinformation, and also a lack of social media expertise, not just from the general public, but actually from a lot of the professional groups who are trying to do this communication. We saw a lot of public health communicators really stumbling because they didn't have that kind of expertise. And so within Canada, during the pandemic, I was part of a group that helped to create something called Science Up First. And the idea here was, well, we can't just keep trying to combat disinformation, conspiracy theories, and so on by debunking them. We actually need to put out social media and bite-sized information that is high quality information that people can then retweet, spread, send to their relatives, and so on and so forth. But it has to be created with social media in mind first, and not just be a distillation of new research. So Science Up First, or La Science d'Abord, was created to really be a movement against misinformation in many ways, but not by, as I've said, countering it, but rather creating evidence-based and social media-focused pieces of information that could be easily spread. And the initial group was a group of independent scientists, researchers, healthcare experts, and science communicators. So really bring together an interdisciplinary group to make this happen. This is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the real reach of this. So this is not something retweeted by 6 people. It's actually used by quite a lot of people. This was March of this year. And of course, will be many more tens of thousands by this point. So just to give you a couple of examples, over 31,000 people have used the hashtags of Science Up First or La Science d'Abord. And those people have a combined following of 549 million people. There are nearly 55,000 people who are following the various pages or signing up for emails. And you'll see that the various pieces of content that were created in the first 14 months of this existence of Science Up First, they were viewed over 24 million times. So that's pretty good for a small nonprofit that's trying to intervene in this space. And I think shows that we need to be thinking also about how we create content and not just how we combat disinformation and online abuse. How can we change this space to have content that's easy for others to share, that is born on social media? Okay, so as I said, it started with COVID-19, but is now broadening into other scientific topics, particularly interested in climate change, because we see so much mis and disinformation about climate change. And finally, I just want to end very briefly, although I'll say this research is very preliminary, not done by me, with just some of the findings that some, particularly psychologists, are coming out with on why individuals are susceptible to disinformation and what we can do about it. So a still preprint, that's why I say preliminary, looking at individuals in 16 countries on 6 different continents, try to come up with and find, are there some particular reasons why individuals are susceptible to mis or disinformation that go across different cultural contexts? And they found 4, none of which have to do with people's age, education level, etc. So I think that's quite important, that all of these are not related to the sorts of things that we usually make attributions on the basis of. So somebody's age, somebody's education, gender, etc., etc. They didn't find that any of those were consistent across different countries. Instead, it was these 4 things. And one was people's tendency to rely on intuition rather than take a bit of a step back and think. The second was the failure to engage in analytical thinking, so to have a knee-jerk reaction rather than take a moment to think analytically about whether this piece of information seemed to be reliable or not. The third was motivated reasoning. So let's say, and this has been demonstrated in many studies, somebody who is a committed Democrat is shown something that is a policy and told it's a Republican policy. They will hate it. If they're shown the same policy and told it's a Democrat policy, they'll be very much for it. And so there are many different types of motivated reasoning, but these often explain why individuals are susceptible to misinformation. And the final one was people who undervalued democracy in some way were more susceptible to misinformation. So we've got all of these problems, and then I'll suggest a few ways that both these researchers and others have tried to think about how we solve these issues. These are all very short term, right? They're about the specific pieces of information rather than the longer term socioeconomic reasons why individuals might undervalue democracy. So the first one way to improve and ensure that people don't solely rely on their intuition is to incorporate what Gordon Pennycook calls accuracy nudges. So small things that one could theoretically introduce in platforms that could nudge people to think about whether something is accurate or not. If any of you are on Twitter and you've tried to retweet an article that you haven't clicked through on Twitter first, you might see that prompt that says, have you read this article? Would you still like to retweet? And you have to say yes or no. That you can think of as a form of accuracy nudge, making sure that you've actually read something before you retweet it. And Gordon Pennycook's research suggests that this can be helpful. It's not a silver bullet, but it can be helpful in improving people's susceptibility, reducing that susceptibility. The second, in terms of motivated reasoning, for some people, they found that when you actually produce digital literacy tips and really help people to think about digital literacy, this can reduce some of that motivated reasoning. And one example of this, created by Mike Caulfield, is what is called the SIFT method, asking people to stop, so pause, don't rely on your intuition, investigate the source, I, find better coverage, F, so search across sites, and fourth, to trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. Caulfield has taught this to a whole host of people and has found that their ability to detect dis or misinformation does improve after being taught these kinds of methods. Now, of course, it's not feasible to do this with every piece of information that one finds, but trying to instill in individuals, one still has a responsibility before sharing. So if you do this before you share something, at least, that may help to change in very small ways the online environment that we see. And then finally, the one that obviously interests me in a whole host of ways that I think remains up for debate, also in our Q&A, is the question of how we address the undervaluing of democracy. I think we would be, of course, deeply misplaced to say that that undervaluing solely comes from online mis and disinformation. We see that these trends in places like the United States began long before the internet, at least in the 1970s, post things like Watergate. They also have much to do with growing socioeconomic inequality. And so to address this susceptibility of undervaluing democracy, we cannot do that through addressing questions of the online environment alone. We'll have to think more deeply about our democratic institutions. And that's, of course, some of the things that we're doing at the Center that I've just become the director of a few months ago, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. So what we try to do there is to understand the past, analyze the present, and then train for the future, whether students or also people involved in public policy as well, to put academic research into action. So then to conclude, to draw up, so we have lots of time for questions. I've taken you on a long sprint, but here are, I think, some of the major takeaways. The first is that disinformation and the disorder of disinformation, often seen as an unprecedented problem, actually has a very long history. In our system of international relations, it is a feature, not a bug. And I can give you plenty of examples in the questions of how that is true. And I think that really helps us to look at this problem in a different light, to see that it is caused not by the internet, but exacerbated and shifted by the way in which the internet functions in new ways that we have to address, but we may have old tools in the toolbox to do so. The second is that dis and misinformation are systemic problems. It's not solely an individual question of a few people plopping this stuff up online, but it's something that's a huge part of how these systems function and what online platforms and the online world enables. And that means we'll need systemic solutions. Taking down individual pieces of content will not solve this broader problem. Having said that, although it's a systemic structural problem, there are still quite a lot of things that individuals can do to improve the information environment. There are small things and questions we can ask ourselves before we share what we can do to make sure that we're not one of those who is susceptible to mis and disinformation. As I've said, education level was not one of the things that showed whether people were susceptible or not to mis and disinformation, something that perhaps many people at universities like to tell themselves. In fact, it's habits of mind, and all of us can cultivate those habits of mind. So with that, I will close, say thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
for sharing with us, your insights and, so rich, right? Historical, definitional, as well as, a number of the recent studies. And I think most important, the solutions. That's where, I think many of us are looking towards, what can be done. I also want to thank, everybody, all the attendees in person and virtual. So thank you so much for joining us for this Rogers Chair event. And of course, my job is to also, make you aware that there's information on the next event on our website. So, please check it out. And I also want to thank everybody for joining us on Digital Citizen Day. I think this is an important day in Canada. So, as I said, tweet, be on social media, tell us what that means. And before we go into Q&A, I have a lot of people to thank. So I want to thank the teams here at FIMS and at Media Smarts, communications, technical teams, administration, who all made this event possible. So with that, I'm excited actually to hear, questions and thoughts. I will be moderating simultaneously the ones on the Zoom as well as in person. So, I'll do my best to kind of divide myself, but we have already one question here on the Zoom. So, Dr. Tworek, the question is, how can researchers guard against public disinformation and abuse from their social media posts? So very practical.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, too, because, of course, another professional group we could have included was academics. And actually, Jagras Hodson, who's at Royal Roads, has done a lot of work looking into academics. So I think a lot of the same tips apply, but I'll give some more concrete ones. One that we tend to see that can be helpful is if, let's say, you're putting out an op-ed or some other piece where you're quite worried that there's going to be disinformation or abuse, one thing you can do is try to get a whole host of people to post something positive as soon as you tweet it out. So you try to create a dynamic of positivity before you get a dynamic of abuse, because one of the problems that we see is, sometimes you'll put something out and then it will just become a pile-on. Whereas if you've got a bit of an opposite, right? So instead of a coordinated disinformation abuse campaign, you create a little bit of a coordinated positivity. That can at least be something that might be a bit helpful. There are, of course, depending on the platform, a whole host of tools that you can use, some of which will only be how you see things, but some of which might help others. So let's say, for example, you really want to have a curated community on something like Twitter. You can lock your account so that other people can see your posts. They might be able to like them, but they can't necessarily either reply to them or retweet them unless you're following them as well. So I'd say one of the key things to do is before you experience any disinformation or online abuse, think about and get familiar with all of the potential tools that each of the platforms you're using have to offer. Because unfortunately, one of the problems is that once you're getting a pile-on of abuse, it becomes a little bit too late because there's just such a huge volume that might be coming at you. One of the things that I try to advocate for in a report, and so have some other people, is also trying to get our universities and institutions to take this problem more seriously. Unfortunately, we see that when researchers experience these kinds of problems, their institutions just aren't equipped to deal with it in a whole host of ways, whether it's removing their office phone number and their office location from a website, or it's even just providing support as they're trying to report online abuse and online abusers. So this is unfortunately something that a lot of researchers continue to push for, because if universities want us to be active in knowledge mobilization, then there needs to be some support, especially for those who are likelier to experience this kind of harassment based on their identity. So this is, I think, an ongoing battle, and we do have enough research to show that we need institutional support as well. So a little bit of the individual, and I think if you can, pushing within your institution to have one or two people who have the social media savvy to help researchers if something goes awry.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so any questions? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a PhD student. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm from Brazil. And as I was listening to the presentation, we have been living this in Brazil a lot these days with the pandemic. There was a lot of misinformation, and problems regarding the communications of the pandemic, especially from Brazilian government and Brazilian president. So, and then we're right now going through elections. We're like in the final week of the elections, and it has been an electoral process really where the misinformation and the bad usage of social media and media in general had had a very important role in how people are voting and participating and so on. And I was thinking while listening to the presentation that it would be so good that people knew more about this reality so they could fight back and be able to think critically and actually assess the information that they are getting and not trusting it, like you said, only by their guts, right? And you did give us some examples of science at first and how we can intervene like directly in this space and provide good information. But another issue that has come up is about regulation of social media and media outlets as a whole. So right now in Brazil, what's happening is that the electoral justice is actually intervening a lot in the campaigns, the electoral campaigns. So they are prohibiting certain ads, they are deleting posts from social media. And also the social media themselves are doing a lot of self-regulation. So like what happened to Trump, it's also happening in Brazil. They delete certain posts from Bolsonaro and from other politicians. So I'd like to know what you think about this media regulation thing, because it also raises a lot of questions about freedom of information and democracy and so on.
Yeah, thanks for your question. And of course, Brazil is a fascinating case for a whole host of reasons. I actually was moderating a CSDI event last week where we were talking about elections and social media in Kenya, Philippines, South Korea, and Brazil. So a lot of my knowledge of social media in Brazil comes from Ivar Hartmann, who's at INSPER in Sao Paulo, who has done a lot of work on this, like many other Brazilian researchers. I'd just say a couple of things. One is, yeah, the Brazilian case is very interesting because of the role of the courts in adjudicating and intervening, and we shall see where this goes and what this means for the sort of politicization of the courts, depending, they're already very politicized, but depending on who wins, we don't know where that's going to go. And the other thing that's super fascinating about Brazil is that despite the massive amount of disinformation, including a lot of disinformation from the top about COVID-19, the vaccination rates in Brazil are still pretty high. So unlike in the United States, where a lot of Republicans are not vaccinated, a higher percentage of Brazilians are vaccinated. And I think we need more studies to understand what are the exact mechanisms that are going on here, how much of this is the influence of some posts, or even of people who are very much Bolsonaro supporters who still got vaccinated, part of a very long tradition of Brazilian support for public health and having actually quite strong public health, and how far is the sort of Republican reluctance in the United States, something that's tied to Trump, but then Trump also put in the money for Operation Warp Speed. There's a lot of things going on here, only some of which are about social media that I think we can tease apart, and especially in the case of vaccination, there's a lot to be said there. Then for your specific question about social media regulation, we've come very far in the last 4 years. We've come from Germany being basically the only country to have specific social media regulation through something called the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or NetzDG, if you don't want to pronounce that large compound noun, which was requiring social media companies to take down within 24 hours posts that users had flagged as contravening 22 statutes of German speech law. Now we've come to 2022, where the European Union has passed something called the Digital Services Act, which is a much more comprehensive look at trying to regulate online platforms. So a couple of ways I think of thinking about this. One is that the researchers, I think, are also trying to move beyond suggesting regulation on individual posts, recognizing that this is a much broader ecosystem in which particular individuals play roles, where the location of platforms also plays a role, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to, I think, divide it, going beyond posts, looking at, as I said, systems and processes, asking for more transparency, but also recognizing that that's only one part of the online world. So in a series I did with Taylor Owen and Nanjala Nyabala, we got research from around the world, including from Brazil, and said, okay, if we want to look at governing platforms broadly, right, not just Facebook, Twitter, etc., but Amazon and so on, where there's also comments, we want to think about this through content, data, competition, and infrastructure, that we need to expand our definition to get beyond just thinking about the post, to understand how are people's private data being used to serve them different types of ads. Is that data being given to governments? How is that problematic? Are there questions around the oligopoly of these platforms? So do we need more competition, regulation? And finally, what about the infrastructure itself, the physical infrastructure? Is it being surveyed? What do we need to do about that? Obviously, now a classic case of Huawei is just one example of that. So I think this is one way we can expand this conversation. And also, I'm personally very committed to making sure this isn't just a transatlantic conversation. We do that by inviting in researchers and elevating voices from people who are researching on and in places from all around the world. And at least what we very much teased out in the event last week is that despite there being similar platforms in South Korea, the Philippines, Kenya, and Brazil, there were some similarities, but actually a lot of differences in how things played out. And we need to have that contextual understanding to really be able to put together regulation that makes sense for each of these places. So the platforms want global content regulation. I personally think historically that's impossible. And also for all of these contextual reasons, very problematic, because it will be a US vision and not a vision from the ground up from places like Brazil.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a lot of questions and comments. We may not be able to get through all of them today. I'm going to see, just looking at the time, maybe we'll get another online and another in-person question. But I have one comment from Marianne Duchette. She says, thank you for such a fascinating talk and for highlighting the landscape for health communications, health communicators. Then we have another question here from Eric Young. Some threats are designed to strike terror in the recipient and can make the recipient fear for themselves and their family. Those threats are usually sent anonymously. Is there an ability of law enforcement to trace who those trolls are? And is the legislation good enough to stop this? So.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think sometimes we see that there can be law on the books, right? Like harassment, not legal, but often it's very difficult for police to deal with it, or they don't take it as seriously as many people believe they should, right? So we see when we talk to interviewees, very uneven responses from law enforcement. In some cases, taking it very seriously. In other cases, not really taking it seriously at all. So that's a big problem. The other is the question of how much training law enforcement has to deal with this. And this is not just to do with social media, but to do with any kind of online crime in general. So very broad brushstrokes within the RCMP and other places. There's quite a lot of resources that are put into CSAM, or child sexual abuse materials. Still an enormous problem, but there are more resources put into that to understand the forensics and so on. All the other types of online fraud, is it credit cards, phishing, abuse, you name it. There isn't as much training, there aren't as many resources. And then the final thing to say is just, it's not clear these threats are always anonymous. I mean, sometimes people are very happy to sign their name to some pretty egregious stuff. And at least in some experiments trying to make people put their real names on comments, we don't actually see that much difference in the amount of abuse, which is surprising because there's often an assumption that anonymity is what breeds this kind of world. And it turns out that's not really true. It seems that it's much more the platforms themselves, the ease, and so on. And to briefly pick up on one of the other questions asking, do we know which platforms are better or worse? That's one of the questions I have to answer with, we don't have enough transparency to know, because we'd have to be relying on what companies say in their transparency reports. I think that's very difficult. It's one of the reasons why I think it's important for researchers to have that kind of data access so we can try to answer some of those questions and not just rely on companies' PR and try to compare from that.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. I see
Thanks so much for the talk and for sharing the work. I really appreciate hearing about all this. I have questions about the targeting of scientists and health communicators. I'm wondering, is that new? Is there a longer history of that, or is that something that's kind of a recent thing? And is it organized? And if it is organized, what do we know about how it's organized and who is doing it? So is it something that's happening from domestic players toward other people within their countries, or are we seeing foreign influence or international influence here? And I guess finally, is it automated? Yeah, so I was really interested in that part of it.
Yeah, these are all excellent questions, some of which are hard to identify. So what I would say is that there is a much longer world of anti-vaxxer activism that existed both offline and online, in which the very much debunked article about MMR purportedly causing autism, which it does not, that's just one example of the much longer history of anti-vaxxer activism. However, there was already quite a lot of paid for anti-vaxxer activism online even before the pandemic, and that was seized upon. So for example, the Kennedy, who is a big anti-vaxxer, is also one of the key people pouring money into that. And he was also during the pandemic a speaker at what became a QAnon rally in Berlin. So here we see the overlapping of networks of anti-vaxxer activism that existed before, money going into that system to buy ads, and then that overlapping with certain types of political conspiracy theories. So the answer is that it's a mixture, right? It is both organized and spontaneous. It is both domestic and international. It is both paid and organic. Some of it automated, yeah, in different kinds of ways, and some of it promoted by algorithms in all sorts of problematic fashion. So that's part of what makes it hard to address, is it is a mixture of all of these different things. I will say that when the pandemic broke out, the platforms responded much faster in terms of trying to figure out what to do than they had with any type of anti-vax activism before, but there remains a tremendous amount to be done. And there are also, I think, questions about if platforms are knee-jerk reacting to new crises, that says that they don't have the protocols in place to be able to deal with these sorts of things. And the final thing that we also find is that a lot of people then, of course, just use code words to evade, right? If you just use a word list to try to detect where people are doing stuff, well, humans are very creative. And so they will use code words to try and circumvent and then organize in, say, a Facebook page or something else like that. And there's plenty of researchers who have certainly uncovered that kind of creativity as well. A couple of other places that are used for this, of course, WhatsApp is another one. And this raises big questions, right? Because some of these platforms like Twitter, easier for us to research. Things like WhatsApp are private messaging. But even then, Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, has tried to find some ways to deal with this. So they have, for example, post an earlier Indian election where some WhatsApp messages and forwarding seem to lead actually to some lynchings and deaths in person. They've limited the amount of people you can forward to. So they don't know what the content is, but they've tried to limit the amount of forwarding. We need a lot more research to really get a grip on what's going on there. And I think it just raises a lot of other questions around privacy that we need to take very seriously. Even though we as researchers want to figure out how to deal with these problems, we also need to account for, as I've said, there's other questions around things like privacy and which governments we want to have access to said types of information. But anyway, to sum up, this is a lot of what makes this problem very difficult to deal with, is because it's all of the factors that you have suggested. And the final one I'll say is there's a huge profit motive. So if you dig down, a lot of the people who are propagating anti-vaxxer activism, which sometimes will also come with a lot of online abuse and obviously disinformation about vaccines, you will find they are selling something. And this is where I think platforms have a responsibility, right? Because we're talking then about that classic old disinformation for profit. So is it about how you screen your ads? You know, we do have regulations around advertising in other spaces. Do we need to think about strengthening that, enforcing the laws that Canada already has on the books about advertisements? And then how do we look into paid posts? We see there was an investigation, it was Brazil, where some researchers tried to put in the election some ads that clearly contravened a platform's policies, and almost all of those ads got through. So that tells us that what companies have on the books as their terms of service is not the same as what they're necessarily enforcing. And so there may be a lot of policies in their terms of service that we would actually say, okay, these seem very sensible, but in reality, they're not really being enforced. And I think that's particularly true in this world of advertisement, paid content, automated content. It would be great to have more transparency about what platforms are doing and to see how much they're really enforcing the rules in terms of service that they have on the books.
Right, well, yeah, very good question. And I mean, obviously the complexity is really difficult to kind of get a sense. Well, I think with that, I really want to thank, everybody for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Tworek, for, being here, sharing with us. Thanks to the online audience as well. And again, 2 p.m. we have a follow-up event. If people have time, we look forward to seeing you there as well. So with that, thank you.